"Sir, I can pay you back." The words came out steady, but they didn't belong in a place like this. Not in a hallway lined with polished marble that reflected light like cold water. Not where every footstep echoed with authority and silence carried weight. Naomi Carter stood just past the invisible line employees were never meant to cross. Her worn shoes still damp from the rain outside, her fingers curled tight around the strap of her bag, as if holding it together could somehow hold her world. Together too, and for a second, no one reacted. Not the assistants walking past with tablets in hand. Not the security guard by the elevator who had already noticed her but hadn't moved yet, because the man she was speaking to hadn't stopped. Richard Hale kept walking, his tailored suit catching the soft overhead light. His pace measured, controlled like everything in his life, but something in her voice. Maybe the calm, maybe the fact that she didn't sound like she was begging, made his step falter just enough to break the rhythm, and that single hesitation rippled through the air like a crack in glass. He didn't turn fully, just enough to glance at her over his shoulder, his expression unreadable, the kind of look that had ended conversations before they began. "Pay me back with what?" he asked, not harsh, not loud, just distant, like the question itself didn't matter, like she didn't. Naomi felt her throat tighten, the sterile scent of the building filling her lungs as she forced herself to breathe slowly, one breath in, one breath out, the way she had learned sitting beside hospital beds where machines beeped in quiet rhythm and time felt like something you could lose if you blinked too long. She could still see her mother's face under the fluorescent lights, pale but smiling, always smiling, even when the numbers didn't make sense, even when the nurse avoided eye contact, even when the bill sat folded on the small plastic table like something too heavy to touch. And, for a moment, Naomi's eyes dropped to the floor, to the reflection of a girl who looked smaller than she felt. Then she lifted her chin again, because walking away wasn't an option anymore. "Not with money?" she said softly, and this time her voice didn't shake. It held, steady and grounded in something deeper than fear, something older than pride, and that made Richard turn a little more, just enough for the light to catch his eyes, sharp, assessing now, curious in spite of himself, because people didn't speak to him like that. Not in his world where everything had a price and everyone knew their place. The hallway seemed to quiet even further, as if the building itself was listening, the distant hum of elevators fading into the background, the soft click of shoes slowing, pausing, and Naomi took a step forward, just one, crossing the last bit of distance that separated them. The space between power and nothing, between being seen and being dismissed. "But I can give you something you've already been losing," she added, and the words hung there, suspended, not loud, not dramatic, just real. And for the first time, Richard Hale stopped completely, his body still, his breath almost imperceptible as something flickered across his face. Quick and controlled but unmistakable, like a memory brushing against the surface, something he hadn't expected to hear. Not here, not from her. And when he finally turned to face her fully, the silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy, charged, waiting for whatever came next. Richard did not speak right away, and that silence stretched longer than it should have, long enough for Naomi to hear the faint buzz of the overhead lights and the distant murmur of voices from the lower floors, long enough for doubt to creep into her chest and press against her ribs. But she held her ground, shoulders squared, eyes steady, because she had already crossed the line that could not be uncrossed. His gaze stayed on her now, no longer dismissive, no longer passing through her like she was part of the furniture, but fixed, searching, as if trying to place something that did not belong in his world. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, controlled but edged with something unfamiliar. "You are a cleaner, correct?" Naomi nodded once, her grip tightening slightly on her bag, the worn fabric creasing under her fingers. "Yes, sir," she said, and the words felt heavier now, not out of submission, but out of habit, something she had learned to say in spaces where people like her were expected to shrink. Richard's eyes flicked briefly to her shoes, to the faint water stains from the rain, to the small details that marked her place in the hierarchy of the building, then back to her face, and there was a pause, a calculation, as if he was weighing whether this moment was worth his time, whether she was worth breaking his routine, and for a second, it seemed like he might turn and walk away after all. Naomi felt that possibility like a cold draft across her skin, but she did not step back. She did not lower her gaze, because somewhere between the hospital room and this hallway, fear had already done its worst, and there was nothing left for it to take. "You said you could give me something I have been losing?" he continued, his tone measured, each word placed carefully. "Explain that." And this time it was not a dismissal, it was a demand, quiet but real. Naomi inhaled slowly, the air cool against her throat, and for a moment her eyes softened, not with weakness, but with memory, the kind that lived behind closed doors and dim lights. "I used to work nights on the 5th floor, she said, her voice lower now, almost reflective, and something in that shift made Richard's posture change, subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders no longer as rigid, his attention no longer divided. "There was a room at the end of the hall," she continued, "with a window that never fully closed, even in winter, and a little girl who did not like the dark." The words settled between them, gentle but precise, and Richard's expression tightened just slightly. Flicker of recognition breaking through the composure he wore like armor. Naomi noticed it, but she did not rush. She did not push. She let the moment breathe the way she had learned to do with patience, with people who needed time more than answers. "She used to ask for stories," Naomi added, her voice steady. "Not big ones, just small ones about ordinary things, like what the sky looked like in the morning or how coffee smelled before sunrise." And the hallway seemed to shrink around them, the polished walls no longer cold but distant, irrelevant, as if they were standing somewhere else entirely. Richard's jaw shifted, his eyes no longer sharp with authority but clouded with something heavier, something he had not expected to feel in a place like this. And, when he spoke again, it was softer, almost unwilling. "That was years ago," he said. Not a question, not quite a statement, more like something he was trying to convince himself of. Naomi nodded slightly, her gaze never leaving his. "Yes, sir," she said. "But some things do not leave just because time passes." And there was no accusation in her tone, no demand, only truth, quiet and steady, and for the first time since she had spoken, Richard Hale did not look like a man in control of the room. He looked like someone standing in the middle of something he could not command, something that did not respond to money or power or distance, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, thick with memory and meaning, and neither of them moved. Richard's fingers curled slightly at his side, a small movement that betrayed the shift happening beneath his composed exterior, and for a moment he looked past Naomi, not at the polished walls or the passing staff, but somewhere deeper, somewhere quieter, like he was standing in a different hallway entirely, one that no longer existed. The faint reflection of light in his eyes dimmed, replaced by something heavier, something slower, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried less authority and more distance. "You should not have been in that wing," he said, but the words lacked force, more observation than reprimand, and Naomi understood that he was not really talking about rules. She gave a small nod, her posture still steady. "I know," she replied, her voice calm, but she was crying. And that simple statement seemed to land harder than anything else she had said, not because of what it revealed, but because of what it implied, that someone had been there when he had not. Richard inhaled slowly, the breath controlled but uneven at the edges, and his gaze returned to Naomi with a new intensity, not sharp like before, but searching, almost cautious. "What did you tell her?" he asked, and the question came out quieter than he intended, as if he was not sure he wanted to hear the answer. Naomi's eyes softened again, not with pity, but with remembrance, the kind that carried warmth even in difficult places. "Nothing complicated," she said. "Just small things she could hold on to," and she paused for a second, letting the memory settle. "I told her the sun would still rise, even if she could not see it from that window, and that morning always comes, even when the night feels longer than it should." And as she spoke, the sterile hallway seemed to fade further into the background, replaced by the faint echo of a child's breathing, the soft rustle of blankets, the quiet rhythm of a world that moved slower, gentler. Richard's jaw tightened again, but this time it was not control, it was restraint, as if he was holding something back, something that did not belong in a place like this, and for a brief moment, his eyes dropped to the floor, to the reflection that no longer looked as steady as it once had. "She used to ask about me," Naomi added carefully, her voice still even. Not in a way that expected answers, just in a way that hoped. And that word lingered between them, fragile but undeniable, and Richard's head lifted slightly, his gaze locking onto hers again, sharper now, but not with authority, with something closer to urgency. "And what did you say?" he asked, and there was no distance in the question anymore, no dismissal, only the quiet demand of someone who needed to know. Naomi did not hesitate this time, because this part had always been clear to her. Even then, even in that dim room with the half-open window and the soft hum of machines, "I told her that sometimes people carry too much to show up the way they want to," she said, her voice steady but gentler now. "But that does not mean they do not care." And as the words left her, the silence that followed was different, no longer heavy with tension, but filled with something that pressed deeper, something that reached beyond the present moment. Richard's shoulders shifted, the rigid line of his posture loosening just slightly, and for the first time, the distance between who he was and who he had been seemed visible, not as a contradiction, but as a gap that had grown too wide to ignore. The hallway remained still, the world outside continuing its quiet motion. But within that space, something had changed, something subtle yet undeniable, and Naomi stood there, not as someone asking for help, but as someone holding a truth that could not be dismissed, waiting, not for permission but for him to face it. The air between them did not move, but something inside it shifted, like a quiet pressure building beneath the surface, and Richard's gaze did not leave Naomi this time. Not even for a second, as if looking away might break whatever fragile thread had formed between her words and his memory. His voice, when it came, was lower, stripped of the polished distance he carried so effortlessly before. "You think you understand something about my life," he said, but it did not sound like an accusation. It sounded like uncertainty wrapped in control, and Naomi did not flinch at it, because she had heard that tone before, not from powerful men in tailored suits, but from people standing at the edge of something they were not ready to face. She shook her head slightly, her expression calm, grounded. "No, sir," she replied. "I just remember what she felt." And that answer landed differently, not challenging him, not confronting him, but removing the need for defense altogether. And for a moment, Richard said nothing, his jaw tightening then easing again, like he was adjusting to a language he had not spoken in years. The hallway lights reflected faintly across the glass walls, soft and distant, and somewhere down the corridor, a phone rang once before being silenced, the world continuing as if this moment did not exist, but inside it, time felt slower, heavier, almost deliberate. "You said," she smiled, Richard said after a pause, his voice quieter now, more focused, as if narrowing in on something he could hold on to. "The last night." Naomi nodded, her eyes steady, and there was no hesitation in her answer. "Yes," she said, right before she fell asleep. And the way she said it carried a certainty that did not need proof, because it had already lived its truth. Richard exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but uneven at the edges, and for the first time, his posture shifted in a way that did not look intentional. His shoulders lowering slightly, as if the weight he carried had just been acknowledged instead of managed. "What made her smile?" he asked, and there was something in that question that had nothing to do with authority, nothing to do with control. It was simple, almost fragile, and Naomi recognized it for what it was, not a test, not a challenge, but a search. She took a small breath, the memory clear in her mind. "I told her a story," she said softly, "about a man who built everything he thought he needed, but forgot to leave the door open for the one thing that mattered most." And the words settled gently, not sharp, not accusing, just present, and Richard's eyes flickered again. Something deeper this time, something that did not fade as quickly as before. "And she understood that?" he asked, almost to himself, and Naomi gave a faint nod. "She did not need to understand it fully," she said. "She just needed to feel that the door was not completely closed." And that line stayed there, suspended in the quiet space between them, and for a moment, Richard looked away, not out of dismissal, but because the weight of it required distance, his gaze shifting toward the window at the end of the hall where the afternoon light pressed softly against the glass. Outside, the city moved as it always did, cars passing, people walking, life continuing without pause, but inside, Something had slowed to a point where even a single breath felt significant. Naomi remained still, not pushing, not filling the silence, because she understood that some moments could not be rushed. They had to unfold on their own. And after a few seconds, Richard's hand moved slightly, not toward his phone, not toward anything practical, but resting briefly against the edge of the wall beside him, as if grounding himself in something real. When he turned back to her, his expression had changed again, not completely, not dramatically, but enough that the distance between who he was and what he was feeling had narrowed, and in that space, there was no longer a clear line between the man of control and the man of memory, only a quiet recognition that something had been left unfinished, something that could not be ignored any longer, and Naomi stood there, not as someone asking for a loan, but as someone who had just opened a door he had spent years keeping shut. Richard's hand remained against the wall for a moment longer, his fingers pressing lightly into the cool surface as if confirming that something solid still existed beneath everything that had just shifted. And when he finally straightened, the movement was slower than before, less precise, like the rhythm he had lived by had been interrupted in a way he could not immediately restore. His eyes returned to Naomi, not with the distant authority he carried at the start, but with a quiet intensity that felt heavier, more deliberate. "You speak like you were part of something you were never meant to be part of," he said, and this time the words held weight, not accusation, but truth wrapped in discomfort, because what she represented did not fit into the structure he controlled. Naomi did not step back, even as the air seemed to tighten again. She simply held his gaze, her voice calm but firm. "I was there when it mattered," she replied, and that answer did not challenge him. It replaced the question entirely, and for a brief second, Richard's expression faltered, the smallest fracture in the control he had rebuilt only moments ago. Down the hall, the security guard shifted his stance, unsure now whether to intervene or stay still, sensing that something was unfolding that did not follow the usual rules, and a pair of assistants slowed their pace, their quiet conversation fading as they passed, glancing just once before continuing, because even in a building where power dictated everything, there were moments that could not be easily categorized. "You should have told someone," Richard said, his tone sharpening slightly as if reaching for structure again, for something that could make this situation logical, manageable. "There were people assigned to that floor," and Naomi nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. "There were," she said, but they did not stay long enough to hear her stop crying. And that sentence landed with a quiet force, not loud, not confrontational, but undeniable, and Richard's jaw tightened again, not out of anger, but because the simplicity of it left no room for argument. The hallway lights hummed softly overhead, their steady glow reflecting off the polished surfaces. But the space felt smaller now, more contained, like everything outside of this moment had dimmed just enough to make what was happening impossible to ignore. Richard exhaled slowly, his breath measured but heavier than before, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different edge, not control, but conflict. "You are asking me for money?" he said, returning to the original reason she had stepped into his path, as if grounding himself in something tangible. "And instead you are telling me stories about the past." And Naomi listened without interrupting, because she understood that this was not rejection, it was resistance, the kind that came when something real began to surface. "I am asking you for time," she said gently, her words steady, deliberate. "Money is just what that time looks like right now." And that distinction hung in the air, subtle but significant, shifting the meaning of everything that had come before. Richard's eyes narrowed. Slightly, not in suspicion, but in thought, as if recalculating something he had always defined in numbers, and for a moment, the silence returned, not empty, but active, pressing against both of them in different ways. Naomi's grip on her bag loosened just a fraction, her shoulders still squared but no longer tense, because she had said what needed to be said, and whatever came next would not be shaped by fear. Richard glanced briefly toward the window again. The city beyond it still moving, still indifferent, and when his gaze returned to her, there was something new in it, something that had not been there before, not fully formed, not yet understood, but present, like the beginning of a question he could not ignore. And though he had not answered her request, the space between them no longer felt like a barrier, it felt like something waiting to be crossed. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling into the space like a quiet weight that neither of them could step around. And for a moment, even the building itself seemed to hold its breath, the usual rhythm of movement fading into something distant and muted. Naomi did not speak again. She did not add to what she had already said, because she understood that this was the part most people avoided, the part where words stopped working and something else had to take their place. Something slower, something harder to ignore, and she simply stood there, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged, letting the moment exist without trying to control it. Richard remained still, but not in the way he had been before, not in that controlled, deliberate stillness that came from discipline. This was different, quieter, less certain, like he was listening to something that did not have a clear voice, and his eyes drifted again, not fully away from her, but slightly past, as if the present moment had begun to overlap with something else, something older. The light from the window at the end of the hallway softened as a cloud passed overhead, dimming the reflection across the floor, and in that subtle shift, the space felt less sharp, less defined, the edges of everything blurring just enough to make room for memory. He could see it now, not clearly, not like a photograph, but in fragments, the outline of a small room, the faint sound of breathing, the quiet question of a child who did not need answers as much as she needed presence. And for the first time in a long time, that absence was no longer something he could push aside. His hand, which had rested against the wall earlier, now hung loosely at his side, no longer anchoring him, no longer steadying anything, and his shoulders, once held with precision, had softened in a way that could not be hidden, even if he wanted it to be. Naomi noticed the change, but she did not react to it. She did not shift her stance or soften her gaze, because this was not about her anymore. It was about what had finally reached him, and she respected that distance, that quiet unfolding. The air felt cooler now, or maybe it was just that everything else had slowed enough for it to be noticed, the faint hum of the building returning, distant but steady, like a reminder that the world had not stopped, even if this moment had. Richard exhaled slowly, the sound almost imperceptible, but it carried something with it, something that had been held back for too long, and when he finally spoke, his voice did not carry the same structure as before. It was softer, less defined, as if the words had not fully decided what they were yet. "She hated the quiet?" he said, and the statement came without context, without explanation, but it did not need either, because Naomi understood exactly what he meant. She gave a small nod, her voice just above a whisper. That is why she needed someone to stay. And there was no judgment in her tone, no implication, just a simple acknowledgement of something that had always been true. The hallway remained still, but the tension that had once filled it was gone, replaced by something heavier, something quieter, something that did not demand resolution but could not be ignored. And in that space, Richard did not look like a man deciding anything. He looked like someone remembering, and that alone was enough to change everything. Richard did not move for several seconds after he spoke, and that stillness felt different now, no longer uncertain, no longer searching, but anchored in something that had finally surfaced, something he could not push away again. And when he lifted his head, the look in his eyes had changed in a way that was impossible to miss, not softer, not weaker, but clearer, like a layer had been stripped away and what remained could no longer hide behind control. "What is her name?" he asked, and this time the question had nothing to do with the past, nothing to do with memory. It was present, direct, and Naomi understood immediately what he meant. Not the little girl from before, but the reason she had stepped into his path at all. "My mother's name is Evelyn Carter," she said, her voice steady, grounded, and for the first time since she had spoken, there was something in her tone that carried a quiet urgency, not desperation, but truth without anything left to shield it. Richard nodded. Once, a small motion, but deliberate, and his gaze did not leave hers as he asked the next question. "Where is she?" And Naomi answered without hesitation. "St. Mary's Medical Center, 3rd floor, room 312. The details coming out clearly, as if she had repeated them in her mind 100 times already, because every second mattered now in a way that could not be measured in anything but time. The hallway seemed to shift again, not physically, but in presence, as if the weight that had filled it was beginning to move, to reshape itself into something else, something that required action instead of silence, and Richard's hand lifted slightly, not in hesitation, but in decision, the movement subtle but final, as if a line had been crossed that could not be undone. He reached into his jacket, the fabric folding softly under his fingers, and for a moment, the sound of it was the only thing that existed, the quiet rustle of cloth breaking through the stillness, grounding everything back into the present. Naomi watched, not with expectation, not with relief, but with a calm. That came from knowing she had already done everything she could, and whatever happened next was no longer something she needed to force. Richard pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up in his hand, casting a faint glow against his palm, and he paused for just a fraction of a second before dialing, his thumb steady, his posture no longer rigid but resolved, and when the call connected, his voice returned not to what it had been before, but to something more precise, more intentional. "I need a transfer arranged," he said, his tone controlled but different now, carrying weight without distance. "Immediate priority." And he turned slightly, just enough to look past Naomi toward the window, toward the city that continued moving without pause, and for a moment, it felt like everything he had built existed on one side of that glass, and everything that mattered existed on the other. Naomi did not speak, she did not interrupt. She simply stood there, her breathing steady, her shoulders still, because this moment did not need anything more from her, and as Richard listened to the voice on the other end of the line, his expression remained focused. But there was something else beneath it now, something quieter, something that had not been there before, not in any meeting, not in any decision, and when he finally ended the call, lowering the phone slowly, the silence returned once again, but this time it was different, not heavy, not unresolved, but settled, like something had shifted into place. He looked at Naomi again, fully now, without distance, without dismissal, and though he had not said the words yet, the answer was already there, clear in the space between them, clear in the way he no longer stood above her, but beside the moment she had created, and for the first time since she had stepped into that hallway, the gap between power and humanity no longer felt like something fixed, it felt like something that had just been rewritten. Richard did not rush to speak, even after the call had ended, and that restraint felt deliberate, like he understood that what had just happened could not be reduced to a simple action or a quick resolution. The phone remained in his hand for a moment longer before he lowered it completely, his fingers relaxing around it as if the urgency had shifted from doing to understanding, and when he finally looked at Naomi again, there was no distance left in his gaze, only a quiet clarity that had not been there before. "They will move her to a private unit," he said, his voice steady, controlled, but no longer cold, "full care, no delays." And the words were simple, direct, but they carried weight in a way that went beyond the decision itself, because this was not just about access or resources, it was about presence, about choosing not to look away. Naomi listened without interrupting, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged on the surface, but something inside her shifted, something subtle, like tension releasing in a place that had been held too tight for too long, and for a second, she lowered her gaze, not out of submission, but out of acknowledgement, because this moment was not something she had expected to reach this far. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words soft but grounded, and when she looked back up, there was no desperation left in her eyes, only a calm certainty that what mattered had already been set in motion. Richard nodded once, but he did not move to leave, and that hesitation felt intentional, as if there was something unfinished, something that could not be resolved with a phone call or a transfer of care. And the silence that followed was not uncomfortable, it was reflective, giving space for what had just changed to settle into place. The light from the window had shifted again, warmer now, casting a softer tone across the hallway, and the reflections on the floor no longer felt sharp or distant, they felt quieter, more grounded, like the environment itself had softened in response to what had unfolded. "You said she needed someone to stay?" Richard said after a moment, his voice lower, more personal now, and Naomi nodded slightly. "She did," she replied, and there was no elaboration, no explanation, because that truth did not need anything more. Richard's gaze drifted briefly toward the far end of the hallway again, but this time it did not carry distance. It carried thought, consideration, and when he spoke again, the shift in his tone was unmistakable. "I was not there," he said, not as a defense, not as a justification, but as a recognition, and the weight of that acknowledgement settled into the space between them, quiet but undeniable. Naomi did not respond immediately, because she understood that this was not something that needed to be answered. It was something that needed to be heard, and after a second, she simply said, "She still felt you." And those words, simple as they were, carried a different kind of impact, not removing what had been missing, but reframing it in a way that allowed something else to exist alongside it. Richard's expression shifted again, not dramatically, but enough that the tension in his features eased, just slightly, and for the first time, there was no sign of resistance left, only a quiet acceptance of something that had been avoided for too long. The hallway remained still, but no longer heavy, no longer filled with tension. Instead it held a different kind of silence, one that did not press or demand, but simply existed, allowing both of them to stand within it without needing to fill it with anything else. And in that space, the moment did not feel like an ending. It felt like something that had finally been acknowledged, something that had been waiting quietly for far longer than either of them had realized. The moment did not end with words, it settled into something quieter, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood, and for a while, neither of them moved, not because they were unsure, but because the weight of what had just passed between them deserved stillness. Naomi adjusted her grip on her bag slightly, the worn straps sliding against her fingers, and she took a slow breath, the kind that came after something long held had finally been released. Not completely, but enough to make space for what came next. The light in the hallway had shifted again, warmer now, stretching across the marble floor in long, soft reflections that no longer felt cold or distant. And for the first time since she had stepped into that space, Naomi turned slightly toward the direction she had come from, not in retreat, but in quiet readiness to leave, because her purpose here had been met in a way she had not fully imagined. Richard watched that small movement, his eyes steady, and there was no urgency in him to stop her. No command, no instruction, just awareness, as if he understood that this moment could not be extended without losing what made it real. "Naomi," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice now, not formal, not distant, but grounded, like he had chosen to remember it rather than simply hear it. She paused, turning back just enough to meet his gaze again, and in that brief stillness, something unspoken passed between them, not agreement, not closure, but recognition. He did not step closer. He did not reach for anything. Instead his hand moved slowly toward the inside of his jacket again, but this time there was no urgency in the gesture, no decision to be made, only a quiet follow-through, and when he pulled out a folded check, he did not look at it. He looked at her, holding it out not as a solution, not as an answer, but as something that existed alongside everything else that had just been revealed. Naomi hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because she did not need it, but because she understood what it meant now, not just money, not just time, but acknowledgement, and when she reached out and took it, her hand was steady, her expression calm, as if she was accepting something that had already been decided long before this moment. "Take care of her," Richard said, his voice low, not instructing, not commanding, simply stating something that mattered, and Naomi gave a small nod, her eyes holding his for a second longer before she turned fully this time, her steps quiet against the polished floor as she walked back down the hallway, away from the space where everything had shifted. The sound of her footsteps faded gradually, blending into the soft hum of the building, until it was gone completely, and the hallway returned to its usual stillness, but not quite the same as before. Richard remained where he was, his posture no longer rigid, his shoulders no longer held in place by control, and for a long moment, he did not move, his gaze drifting toward the window at the end of the hall where the city stretched out under the fading light, unchanged and indifferent. He stood there not as a man who had solved a problem, not as someone who had regained control, but as someone who had finally seen something clearly, something that could not be managed or measured, only felt, and in that quiet, the space around him seemed larger, not emptier, but open in a way it had not been before, and though no one else in the building would notice the difference, it was there, subtle and real, like a door that had been closed for years now standing just slightly ajar, letting something in that could not be ignored again.